So here's what the final product will look like. We'll have a bit different from this. This was built for an iPhone 4. So we have black bars above and below to kill off the extra space that we have. But we have a settings page. We're going to click on it. We're going to go to a new page called settings. We're going to hit the home button, go back to the home page. And then for this high scores page, we're going to rename it as a teams page because it makes more sense to have teams as the title. And it'll just have Jays, Leafs, Raptors. So this is our basic table view that we're going to introduce in this app this time around. It won't do anything. In the next app we do, we're going to go heavier into tables. And we're going to have customized tables with graphics and subtext and whatnot, and be able to click on any one of these and have it launched into another page. So that's the goal of that. What we'll do is we'll hit home, and we'll have, that's our app for this exercise. So I'm just going to hit the home button just to get rid of that. We're going to start off by creating a new project, and it'll be a single view application. So iOS application, single view application as usual. We'll hit next. We'll give it a name. I'm going to call this one Nibs and Tables. Alright, so everything else stays the same. Objective-C is a language, universal device. Uncheck all of the other items there. We'll just hit next. And give it a home. Right, and so we have our typical project setup, and we're going to do something that might scare you. We're going to take main storyboard and delete it. No, but here we go. And not only are we going to delete it, we're going to move it to trash. So make it permanent. So fear not, people, we will get stuff to display on the screen. But I will mention that you can actually get stuff to display on the screen without storyboards or nib files at all. Like, you can code things to display on the screen. And we're going to use some of the methods that today to get the nib files to display on the screen. We could actually use them to display labels and buttons and whatever we want to display on the screen. We can do that manually. Since we have the project settings listed, and since we deleted the main.storyboard file, we have to do one more setting here, and that's here under main interface. We're going to take main and delete that and make it blank. And we're going to call up our nib files manually in code. Since we're at it, we're going to make a portrait app, so let's uncheck landscape left and landscape right. We'll leave portrait. And we have this other checkbox for upside down, and we could check that. But I was actually in a training session with Apple on Friday, learning about the Swift language, and they mentioned that while you have the option for upside down, which is basically just taking the phone upside down, and you can still view your app, while you still have that capability, they frown upon it, even though they added the feature in. They don't like it. The reason they don't like it is because suppose you're using your phone's upside down. All of a sudden you get a phone call, you put it up to your ear and say hello, but the problem is your phone's upside down. So you have to actually take the phone, flip it back up, and then put it to your ear and actually talk to the person. So they consider that like a nuisance to the user. So they don't like using upside down themselves, and so they do not recommend checking this off. But you have that option if you really, really want to. So at this point we'll just have portrait checked, and what we'll do is we'll start creating files and groups. So I'm going to right click and say new group. And we'll say Viewcontrollers. Another new group. Nibs. And we'll actually mean it when we're using nibs this time. We'll say new group. And special classes. And what we'll do is we'll take app.delegate.h and .m. Drag those to special classes. We'll take launch screen.storyboard, throw it under nibs. We'll take Viewcontroller H and M, put those under Viewcontrollers. And so we have our project laid out, but now we have to add some new files. So we have this 3-page app we're going to build. And what we're going to do now is create the Viewcontroller objects for those other 2 pages. We already have the viewcontroller.h.nib. We need to make the other 2 view controllers. So we're going to right click on Viewcontrollers, the folder, and say New File. And we'll say iOS source Cocoa Touch class. And it's a subclass of UI View Controller. I'm going to call this one Settings View Controller. And normally we leave this unchecked. Also create XIB file or Nib file. We're going to check it this time. So we're not only creating a view controller object, we're creating the Nib file for it. And the nice thing about this checkbox is that it does the configurations that are needed behind the scenes to get the Nib file up and running. We're going to unfortunately have to manually configure one Nib file because it's going to be related to the home page. We deleted main.storyboard where all that configuration was already done for us, so we have to actually do that ourselves, and we'll get to that in a moment. But for now, Settings View Controller, subclass of UI View Controller, create a Nib file. You have the option of an iPhone or an iPad. You can choose it. I'm going to go with iPhone this time around. I'm going to stick to iPhone 5 as I usually do. And language is Objective-C. So we'll hit Next, and you can give it a home. And you'll notice that it created a settings viewcontroller.h, settings viewcontroller.m, and settings viewcontroller.xib. I'm going to take the .xib file and drag it to the nibs folder so it's organized. You'll notice that the look and feel of the settings viewcontroller.xib looks different from our typical storyboard. And we'll get into more details in a moment once we have created all our files. So we're going to do this one more time. So right click on View Controllers, say New File, iOS Source Cocoa Touch class. This one we'll call Teams View Controller. So Teams View Controller, subclass of UI View Controller. Check off the also create XIB file. I'm choosing iPhone again with language Objective-C. And then we'll hit Next. And give it a home. And so it did the same thing again. We have Teams View Controller.h, Teams View Controller.m, Teams View Controller.xib. We'll drag the Teams View Controller.xib over to the nibs folder. And so I have almost all my nib files. I have all my view controller files that I want to work with. I just need a nib file to work with the view controller H&M file. So we're going to add that ourselves by hand. So we'll start off right-clicking on nibs, the folder, saying New File. This time it'll be iOS User Interface and View. So iOS User Interface View. We'll hit Next. And I'm going to call this one, I'll keep it as View. I'll just put the .xib extension at the end of it. And just hit Create. So it's just going to be called View. And so now I have all my files that I want to work with. Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll configure the views and then we'll write the code after. So I'm going to start with launch screen.storyboard. We're going to keep it because it'll basically have all of our launch screen look and feel, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel with launch screens. I'm going to set this up as an iPhone 5 launch screen, so view controller, and then highlighting the attributes inspector, changing size to iPhone 4-inch, orientation, portrait, and I'll probably add like a label that says loading. center it. We change the color. Maybe increase the font. All right, and that'll be our launch screen. Now let's go to the home page. So view.xib. Now, as I said earlier, the look and feel of the xib file is a bit different, but it actually is very similar in all regards. Just a few minor things are different. So you may have this guy down here, your listing of everything. The words might be different, but they still do the same function. They just have different names. So you see something called Files Owner. I'm going to minimize this for real estate reasons and just show you the icons here. So I mouse over the yellow cube. It says Files Owner. Files Owner is just another word for Viewcontroller. They used to call it Files Owner before they introduced Storyboards. And then they realized that really Files Owner is just a Viewcontroller. So why don't we just call it Viewcontroller? Because it makes more sense. So when you see Files Owner, we're really talking about Viewcontrollers. We still have First Responder. We have no use for it. But we also have View. We also have View here. And this is basically responding to this guy. This entire view screen that we have here. So what we're going to do with highlighting View is making sure that Attributes Inspector is highlighted. We're going to change the size to the size we want. So I'm going to use iPhone 4-inch with a portrait orientation. Now, we have a couple more steps to do before we start adding stuff onto this screen. And that is because we created this file manually. There's a couple of settings behind the scenes that we have to do ourselves, right? Because it wasn't done for us. So I'm going to click back to Files Owner. And if I click on the third option, the Identity Inspector here, you'll see that it's subclassed to something called NSObject, right? Just a generic NSObject. By default, this would have been subclassed to Viewcontroller in the storyboard, but because we deleted the storyboard, we have to do this ourselves. So we're going to subclass this to Viewcontroller. And so now this links this screen to the viewcontroller.h&m file that's available in our disposal. So now the Viewcontroller object is connected to the screen, but there's one more setting we have to do. So all Viewcontroller objects have a view variable inside of it. And that view variable physically points to this screen. And so we have to connect that in the Connections Inspector. So you see a little variable called view here. We have to connect that to this square or the main screen, either one, but I feel it's safer to do it directly to the square called view. So we're going to connect view to view. Alright, so we now have our view connected to view. Those are the two main settings we have to do. And so if we don't do this, we'll get an app crash. Okay. Alright, so now what we're going to do is we're going to just put a label onto the screen. So we're going to search for label. I just happen to have it up. Label is just going to have the title. And for the title, I'll just say nibs and tables intro. And I'm going to add a couple buttons. So this first button will say View Settings. Second button will say View Teams. So now this page is done. So we'll use the Command S to save it. So now we have two buttons, we have a title, and we've configured this page to work. Now if you try running this app, this page still will not appear. Right, we have to manually get it to appear in code. But what we want to do first now is configure the other two pages, then we'll come back and work on this page some more. So let's go to Settings, Viewcontroller, and we'll configure it to be an iPhone 4-inch. So I'm going to make sure View is highlighted, size is iPhone 4-inch, orientation, portrait. I'll put a nav bar on the top. So put nav bar. And this title will just be Settings. If you want, I can change the color. And so we want to have a back button, so we'll say bar button item. And this will just say back or home. And so we're done with the settings button or settings page. So we'll save this file. And finally, the Teams page. So we'll go to Teams Viewcontroller, highlight View, size will be iPhone 4-inch, orientation, portrait. We'll add another nav bar to it. Title will be Teams. And I'll tint this one as well to the same color. Add a back button, so bar button item. Let's have the word back. And actually, one thing I'll point out is that the configurations we did in view.nib were already done for us. So if I click on Files Owner and I go to the identity inspector, I see Teams Viewcontroller is already casted here. It's already been done for me. And if I click on the Connections inspector, View and View are already connected. So this is already done. So those two steps, extra steps we did in view.nib, they're done for us in both the other nib files because we checked that checkbox that said create a nib file for me. So I went ahead and actually did all the extra settings that we're normally supposed to do ourselves. So one last thing we have to want to do with Teams is actually add a table. So here we're going to put a table listing our different sports teams in Toronto. So we're going to search for table. And we see table view comes up. So we're going to take table view and drag it and resize it to fit the rest of the screen, because that's what we're going to use for the rest of this. There. And you'll notice that it lists out all the different cities in California by default, but if you were to run this page and view it, in reality, you would see blank with just the line separating different cells. And we'll talk more about the tables itself in the next class, but for here, we're just going to get the table up and running and to display, well, really display nothing. It won't even show you the different cities either. This is just placeholders just to tell you that, hey, you put a table view on the screen and interface builder, and that's about it. So what we're doing here is just dragging a table view. Now if I look at the attributes inspector, there's a lot of settings here, but none of them relate to displaying data physically on here. What we have to do now is actually write the code to display this data behind the scenes inside the Viewcontroller object. So a lot of the configuration is going to happen behind, inside the Viewcontroller.m file. Or in this case, the Teams Viewcontroller.m file is where it's going to happen. But there's one special setting we have to do, and that is in the connections inspector for the table view. So making sure that table view is highlighted, you'll notice that there's two settings, data source and delegate. We have to connect these to files owner or view controller. And I'll tell you why in a sec, but we're going to take data source, drag it to the yellow cube, files owner, connect it, and we're going to do the exact same thing with delegate. We're going to connect that to the yellow cube as well, files owner. And so we now have this table fully configured, ready to go. Well, all that's left to do is to write the code for it. Now, the code for this, like I was saying earlier, will go inside the view controller for which this screen is connected to. So this is Teams View Controller. So we're going to write the code to get this thing to display, and that'll be the next class. But the reason we connected these was basically tell the table view, hey, you got those methods. They exist inside this files owner, which happens to be the Teams View Controller. Right? So it says go and look inside Team View Controller .h and .m for the methods you need. All right, to get yourself up and running. That's the whole purpose of it. So now the screens are fully configured. All that's left to do now is to get the pages to display. Now this isn't enough. If you try running this app on its own, it will not display anything. It may display the loading screen, but that's about it. And then it'll go straight to blank. So what we need to do is we need to configure and write the code to get this to happen. First we're going to do is we're going to go into appdelegate.h, because all the work's now going to happen inside appdelegate.h. So we created 3 view controller objects, and we're going to use these. We're going to swap these view controllers in and out onto the window object, but we need to create variables to hold the information for all 3. And so we're going to import the header files for all 3 here. We're going to say import viewcontroller.h, import settings viewcontroller.h, and import Teams viewcontroller.h. And we're going to create the variables for all 3 items. So we're going to say view controller. I'm going to call this one home VC. We're going to declare settings view controller. I'm going to call this one settings VC. I'm going to declare Teams view controller. Call this Teams VC. And we'll do the property declarations for all 3. And the header file is done for now. We're going to come back and add more to it, but the variables are at least done for now. Now you'll notice that there's a variable called window of type UI window. This variable, its purpose is to serve, like I said earlier, as the middleman between the physical screen and your code. So if you want to get something to display on the screen, you send it to window. You send your view controller to window, and then it'll display that on the screen for you. You want to take something off the screen, you tell window to take it off the screen. Okay, so that's how it works. So we're going to save this file. We're going to move over to appdelegate.m. And we're going to synthesize everything. So home VC, settings VC, teams VC. But I'm also going to synthesize window as well, because it wasn't synthesized here. Now, if we were to launch this app again, like I said, you still won't be able to see anything. You just see a blank screen. Our purpose now is to get the home page to display. And the best place to do that is inside did finish launching with options. Because what happens here is that, like we talked about in an earlier app, was that did finish launching with options is kind of like the constructor for the app. So essentially, it will auto-load any code that you put inside those curly brackets. And so you may have default code that you want to execute, such as connecting to a database or getting connected to Game Center or whatever you want to do. In this case, we want to load a home page, so we're going to do it inside did finish launching with options. All right, so what we're going to do now inside did finish launching with options is get this home page to launch. And there's 4 steps to getting the home page to launch. The first step is to initialize the window object. So we're going to say self.window is equal to UI window so self.window is equal to UI window alloc init with frame. Now the argument for init with frame is a CG-rect object. We're going to get into CG objects in a few apps from now. They are special objects that depict length, width, height, points, XY coordinates. So there's CG-rect, there's CG-frame, there's CG-point. There's a number of different CG objects out there, and a number of different CG functions that you can use for manipulating locations and checking if stuff exists inside other things. It's a very powerful set of objects that you can work with. What this is asking for is, tell me the size of the window that I'm dealing with here. And the window, when I say that, I mean the screen size. So it's asking, how big is the screen? So is this an iPhone 5 screen? Is this an iPhone 4 screen? Is it an iPad 2? Is it an iPad Pro? What am I dealing with? So I have to go and request that information from another function or another method. So I'm going to open up a new set of square brackets and say UI screen, main screen, closing that off with bounds. So the object UI screen knows the dimensions of the device. So now this is the whole reason we can take this app and launch it on an iPhone 5 or an iPhone 4 or an iPad, and it'll work the way we want it to work. So we've basically instantiated the window object. We've told it that this is an iPhone 5 or an iPhone 4, whatever device it is. Now our next step is to actually instantiate the home page object. So we're going to say self.viewcontroller, self.homevc is equal to viewcontroller alloc init with nibname. So init with nibname is the constructor for the viewcontroller object, and it basically allows you to connect a nib file to a Viewcontroller object. So this first argument is a string. It's asking for what the nib file will be that will be loaded whenever I want to load this Viewcontroller object. And so we have view.xib. That's our nib file name right there. And so what we want to do now is provide that as an argument here as a string, but we're going to omit the .xib extension. So we're just going to say, opening up a string, we're going to say view. And that's it. Now you be very careful with the spelling depending on what you're passing in here, because if you misspell the nib file name, you'll get an app crash saying nib file not found, essentially. And it's also case sensitive, so I use capital V in my view, so I have to make sure I have capital V. So you gotta be very careful about how you spell this argument here. Now the second argument is bundle. We're gonna put nil. Bundle is an argument of, and it's looking for an NS bundle object. What it is that it's looking for to see if you want to pass any data into the view controller. So you can actually pass data between view controllers through the NS bundle object and through the NS bundle argument. And so suppose I had like database information I want to pass in, I could do that. Any other reason I can pass in information directly to a view controller, and then inside view.load extract that information that's passed in. So a very convenient thing. So for now we'll just put nil. We're not going to pass any information in. So we have instantiated to our view controller. Now there's just two more steps involved. So now we're going to set the view controller to be the home page that we just instantiated. So we're going to say self.window.root viewcontroller is equal to self.homevc. So this is basically saying take this and set this as my home page. This will always be my home page. And then the last step is, as Picard would say, make it so. So we're going to say self.window make key and visible. This line goes ahead and says, okay screen, go ahead and give yourself power and get this thing to display. And so you can actually run this app now. So I'm going to choose an iPhone 5S. I'm going to start running this. There's our launch screen. And there's our home page. And the buttons don't work. Okay, so now we have the nibs and the nibs homepage, nibs and tables intro with the two buttons. The buttons don't work. We're gonna get the settings button to work now. So we're gonna stop this, and inside the appdelegate.m file, what we're going to do is we're going to add the methods we need to move between pages. But there's actually a convenient thing inside this page, or inside Xcode, that we can take advantage of. A very convenient tool. Because we have a lot of methods here, there's a lot of scrolling to do. Instead of doing that, we can actually click up here, and we actually see all the list of methods, and we can jump between methods really quickly. And as we get bigger and bigger files, this becomes really, really useful to do. But we can also take this and organize this into categories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a line up here, and this isn't part of code, it's just more of a compiler directive for Xcode, just to help with navigating Xcode. So I'm going to say above did finish launching, I'm going to say pound pragma mark, and I give it a title. So I'm going to say app methods. And if I go back to this listing, I see app methods here now. So I can categorize my code inside the same file, and it makes it easier to jump between methods. And so now I'm going to go to the bottom of the page. I'm going to do the same thing again, down here at the bottom. I'm going to push this up a bit further so it's easier to see. But right here above end, I'm going to say pound pragma mark, and I'm going to say view methods. I'll do one more here. I'll say pound pragma mark, and I'll say view home methods. And if I go back here to the listing, I see view methods and view home methods as extra categories or labels here. So it's just a convenient way to jump between methods inside the same file. I mean, you can actually take a step further. You can actually, all these drop downs work. So you can jump between files and folders, right? So you actually don't even need the project sidebar here. If you need more real estate, you can actually jump using the top bar. It's a really convenient tool to have. But what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating a method to go from the home page to the settings page. So I'm going to say void return type. And I call this method flip to settings. And inside this method, we're going to run the code we need to run to get the home page to display the settings page. Now there's a few steps involved in doing this, and it involves instantiating the settings object. Then the next step is to get the animation to happen, because we want to have an animation happen at the same time. We want to be able to not only switch pages, but have something happen to make it look nice, give it a little bit of pizzazz. And then the next step is to take the home page off the screen. Then we're going to put the settings page on the screen, and then we're finally going to say make this all happen with an animation. So there's a bunch of steps involved. So our first step is to actually instantiate the settings object. So we're going to say settings Viewcontroller. I'm going to call this SVC is equal to settings Viewcontroller alloc, and this line will sound familiar. We're going to say init with nib name again. So same thing we did above and did finish launching, similar line. Provide the nib name. So we have settings Viewcontroller.xib. We're going to use the same name. We're going to say in a string settings Viewcontroller, and be very careful of the spelling here. Just omitting the .xib extension, but be very careful of this name, because you get an app crash if you try and click on the button to go to this page. So you want to be very careful of that. Second argument bundle will be nil. So we've instantiated the settings Viewcontroller object. We're going to save it as settings VC. So we'll say self.settingsVC is equal to SVC. And we could have done this all in one line, I know, but decided to separate it out for illustrative purposes. But of course you can do this all in one line instead of two lines. Now the next area we're going to focus on is to get the animations going. So we're going to start by telling the view that we are beginning an animation here. So we're going to say UI view begin animations, with both arguments being nil and nil. So now we're saying we're beginning an animation. The next step is to tell it how long the animation is going to last. So we're going to say UI view set animation duration, and it's just a number. We'll just say 1 second, so like 1.0. So this animation will last 1 second. Then the next one is to say what kind of animation to do. So we're going to say UI view set animation transition. Now the arguments that appear here are basically, what kind of animation do you want to do? And there used to be so many animation types, and Apple really took away a lot of them and reduced it down to just a few. And so we're going to pick one and work with it. And whenever you work with animations, you should really be consistent and pick just one. You really should just stick to one animation for consistency. Actually, in this app, I'm going to use different types just to illustrate what they all look like, but just for illustrative purposes. So we're going to say UI view animation transition flip from left. So it gives that sort of flipping or revolving door type animation. Now going to the settings page, I'm going to use flip from left, But for the home button and going back to the home page, I'm going to use flip from right, just to give it that effect of going back to the home page. So I'm going to choose flip from left. For view, we'll use window. So for the window object. And cache, yes, we're going to cache it, because we're going to take advantage of this animation later on when we're coming back to the home page. So just to be able to save on memory, or to save on performance, not necessarily memory. So we set animation duration, we set animation transition. Now we have to go ahead and switch the pages. So we're going to say home VC dot view remove from super view. This line says take my home page off the screen. So at this point the screen will be blank. It'll have nothing on it anymore. And now we want to put something on it. We want to put the settings page on it. So now we're going to say settings VC dot view, self.window. Let's try it again. So self.window, add subview, settings VC dot view. This is saying to the window, okay, you're blank right now. Let's take the settings page and put that on. So put that on the screen. And then the final step is just to say make it so, like Picard would say. So UI view, commit animations. And that's it for this method. So there's a lot of coding here that in the storyboard world we would have done with one drag and drop click. But this is what's going on here. So just to recap what's happening, first we take the settings page, we instantiate that object, that Viewcontroller object. Then we set up the animation. So we want to say we are beginning an animation. So we're telling the window we're beginning an animation. We're going to tell it that it's 1 second. We're going to tell it that it's a flip from left animation. And then we go ahead and switch pages. So now we take the home page off the screen. We're going to put the settings page on the screen. And in the end, make it all happen. All at the same time, make it look pretty. That's really what's going on here in these 6 lines of code. The beauty of this is that these are the same 6 lines of code that'll happen over and over and over again. So in this app, we'll type it out again. But in the next app, we're going to simplify it down to a couple of methods, generic methods. So we don't have to call this over and over again. So for now, this method is done, but we have to call it somewhere. So this method is expected to be called when we click on the settings button. So we got to create an event handler for the settings button. So to do that, we got to put this method declaration in the header file so it's available to the outside world. So we're going to copy and paste flip to settings. So copy, paste it into the appdelegate.m file. At the bottom, and throw a semicolon at the end of it. So now it's available to anybody that imports appdelegate.h. Okay. So now we can go to viewcontroller.m and actually create an event handler there. So we go to viewcontroller.m and we import appdelegate.h. Now we can call that method. But first we have to create an event handler. So we're going to say IB_action. I'm going to call it go to settings. And like we explained in a previous app, we don't instantiate the app delegate because it's a singleton object. It's only ever instantiated once and only once. We never do it again. So we request access to this object. Right? So we're going to say app delegate. I'm going to call it main delegate is equal to, and we're going to cast it to app delegate, UI application, shared application, delegate. And from here we can call that method. So we're going to say main delegate flip to settings. Now, last step, connect this event handler to the button. So we go to view.nib, and highlight files owner, and you should see go to settings there. Connect that to the settings button with a touch up inside, and run it. Okay, so we hit view settings, we have our settings page. Hit back, it doesn't work. So now the last step is to get the back button to work. So we're going to go back to appdelegate.m, and we're going to create another method. I'm going to call it void return type flip to settings home. And you're going to notice that the code we do here is going to be very similar to what we did in the flip to settings method. So we're not going to instantiate the home page because it was already instantiated in did finish launching. So it's already there. We don't need to reinstantiate it. That's just a waste. But we want to do animations. We want to tell it how long it is. We want to tell what kind it is. And then we want to swap these views. We're going to change these two lines around a little bit, because we're gonna remove the settings page and put the home page on, and we're just gonna commit the animation. So you'll see a lot of redundant code over here, but we're just gonna do it just for illustrative purposes, just for practice, essentially. And then the next step will simplify things. So over here, we're gonna just go right into the animation part and say UI view, begin animations, nil and nil. And actually, we want to do a UI view set animation duration, and we want to say 1.0, but we're going to do this over and over again. So because we want to have the animation duration consistent all through our app, we should probably create a constant for this. So let's jump back to appdelegate.h for a moment and create a constant. So I'm going to say #define animation duration as 1.0. So if you recall from C, #define was the keyword for creating a constant. And we can use text or strings as constants as well, but we're going to set this to be a floating number. So #define animation duration, we'll set it to 1.0, and there's no semicolon at the end of it, just like with the imports. So going back to the M file, we're going to change that 1.0 to animation duration. And above, we'll do the exact same thing. It shouldn't have any effect on the performance of the app, it's just a constant to save ourselves some headache. Alright, so we're beginning the animation, we're setting how long it is, we're going to tell it what type it is, so UI view, set animation transition, and we used a UI view flip from left before, but we want to go in the opposite direction, so we want to say flip from right. For view window, we don't want to cache it this time because we're undoing everything we're doing here, and we don't want to leave any memory used up that isn't necessarily needed to be used up. So we're going to say no to caching. So we've got the animation set up. Now all that's left to do is to swap the pages. So we're going to say settingsvc.view remove from superview. So now we're taking the settings page off the screen, and we're putting the home page back up. So now we're going to say self.window, add subview for homevc.view. And then the last thing is, as Picard would say, make it so. So we're going to say UI view, commit animations. And essentially that's it for this method. But because we're done with it, and we don't know if we'll ever go back to settings page ever again. We may or may not. Who knows? We have the option of taking the settings object, settings VC, and freeing that up earlier. We know that automatic reference counting, or ARC, will clear that up for us eventually. We just don't know when. So we can accelerate that process by saying settings VC is equal to nil. And so now we've freed up that memory as well, and now we're really done with this method. The only step left is to add this to an event handler and get the home button working now. Alright, so to do that, we're going to take the flip to settings home method. We're going to copy this and paste this into appdelegate.h. Below flip to settings, and put a semicolon at the end of it. So if we go to settings viewcontroller.m, we have to create the event handler. And the first step we have to do is actually import appdelegate.h. And then create the event handler. I'm going to call this one go home. And like we did before, we're going to request access to the app delegate. So you could basically copy and paste the code from the view controller, but I'll type it out again for you. So say app delegate main delegate equals app delegate star UI application shared application delegate. And then call main delegate flip to settings home. Alright, so the last step is to actually connect this to the event, to this event handler to the home button. So now we can go to settings view controller, highlighting files owner, go home is there, connect that to the back button, and now you can run this thing. So, unlike just connecting the back button to a little exit icon in the storyboard, we actually have to create an event handler and connect the event handler to the back button. So now you can go ahead and give it a run. There's our loading page. Click on settings, click on the back button, goes back. So now what used to take a couple of button clicks in the storyboard now takes an hour and a half to do. Or I guess the other way around. What used to take an hour and a half to do, we can now do in a couple of button clicks on a storyboard.